It's a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce to you this afternoon Indrit Gill, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist here at the World Bank Group, and Daniel Lee, who is the Division Chief of World Economic Studies here at the International Monetary Fund. And then we're going to hear a couple of perspectives from our parliamentary colleagues. Right, just to open our Parliamentarians' reflections then, we're going to go to Kwaku Kwarteng, who's the Chair of the Finance Committee in Ghana.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Kwaku Kwarteng. I'm a Member of Parliament in Ghana. Listening to the not too pleasant outlook, I'll try to look at how the recovery for those of us from developing countries should look like, given the kind of outlook that we just have been briefed of. But it will be helpful before we look at even that to look at how our economies were before COVID. What exactly did our economies look like before COVID made it worse, as a result of which we're having to discuss the recovery? Fact is, for many of us in developing economies, we had been registering and reporting deficits almost as a way of life. Every year we overspend our budgets, and then the way we finance that gap is to borrow to finance the current gap, but also to service the debts for previous years. And then the subsequent year, we still overspend, so we need to borrow more, use a part of that debt to finance the current year over expenditures, but also to service the debt from previous. So we have been running our economies almost like some kind of Ponzi scheme. We never paused to ask ourselves, so where are we going? Where is this all going to end? And borrowing to finance both capital and recurrent expenditure had become a way of life for many of our economies. So if you look carefully, even before COVID, the threat of macroeconomic instability had always been lurking visibly beneath. So COVID only came, as we have been reminded of several times, COVID only came to worsen a not too pleasant situation. And to put it in another way, COVID, in my view, came to remind those of us in developing economies that we didn't have time. And the earlier we set about to fix this weakness, this fundamental weakness in the way we have managed our economies, the better it will be for us. When I look at the outlook, I don't get a sense that people would come from elsewhere to help us. Everybody is minding their own issues. Of course, we are part of the global economy and we have our development partners, but the fact remains that our salvation would rest in our own hands. So, what should be done? I think the first source of action should come from our governments. We should take advantage of the general sense that things are tough to convince our populations that spending money we do not have on public projects can no more continue. And that it is in our own interest and in the interest of the future of our economies that we begin to spend within our means. But I think in doing this, especially for those of us in politics, we should lead by example. We should spend less on ourselves as political leaders and send a clear message to our people that we're in this together. In many countries, it is so difficult to push the discussion about cutting public expenditure to live within our means, because they're always telling those of us, I'm a member of parliament, and so I'm clear in my mind what I'm saying. They are always quick to point to the things we political leaders are doing wrong as a result of which you find it difficult then to do the reforms that are needed to ensure that in the long run you can stabilize our economies. That's my favorite point. As political leaders, we should begin to lead by example. And then I also think that the fiscal cannot just be tackled by looking at the expenditure side. Of course, we should look to spend within our means, but I also think we should step up our efforts to mobilize domestic revenue. In many of our countries, you have very powerful people not paying taxes, and we do not have the revenue mobilization infrastructure to get everybody to pay their fair share of the taxes, and so we definitely are collecting less than we should. I think it is time to look at that as well. And maybe in this regard, we need to commend the Ghana government for its current reforms of its exemptions regime, where big business and powerful people in the past were not paying taxes in the name of tax exemption for investment promotion. Government is taking steps to correct that. I think we should stay the course. I know the powerful forces against these reforms. We should stay the course and ensure that everybody would pay their part of the taxes. The next source of action should be our development partners. Of course, I have already made a point that our salvation lies in our own hands, but I think our development partners have a role to play. It is not for nothing that we came together to form these institutions, so we'll help each other. And I think first and foremost, especially where we are now, most developing economies will have difficulty getting out of whatever COVID and the Russian war have brought without some debt relief. And I speak of Ghana as an example. Without debt relief, I'm just hoping that as a result of what is happening, we all come to the realization that things have to happen differently. But it's entirely possible to come to that realization, and yet, because of the burden of debt, you just cannot get out of this. And I think debt relief is more necessary now than ever. I heard a message yesterday that the nature of our debts, unlike in the past where HIPIC was easy because it was largely multilateral debt, now you have a lot of private investors in there, so it becomes difficult. I still think that if there's a commitment to do it on the part of our development partners, we will be able to influence other creditors to also see the case for these developing economies. The second is, my second point is premised on the fact that, governments, and since I'm focusing on developing economies, government in developing economies finance their budget overruns through borrowing. There's no other way of doing so. Now, our development partners in the past, it seems to me, have been very diplomatic about exposing governments whose borrowings have obviously become unsustainable. I think we should call out governments that overspend. It is clear, you can look at our budgets, it's always clear. Our DPs should call out governments that are borrowing more than they should, so that the investors who make monies available to finance these budget overruns would know that they're putting their money in very risky places. Finally, I think it should come to parliamentarians. We get to parliament because our people like us. We may not necessarily be people with the understanding, fiscal understanding of government policies. It's important that we upgrade ourselves in order to be able to understand the fiscal implication of government policies, so that when our governments bring the request for policy approval and expenditure approvals, we'll be able to understand the fiscal implication and tell government that no, we are not going to do this because we've been doing this for so long, it has been unhelpful. So in the end, I guess think that in this period of recovery for developing economies and giving the outlook that we have been shown, I think we should do things differently. And we, the parliamentarians and our parliaments, should be holding the whip. I thank you very much.
Great.